its recognition at the federal level of the importance of the ban, it overlaps with state-based legislation. So the states, Victoria's led the way, and they've sought to ban not only the swastika, but its use in public space, so Nazi symbology effectively. And really what this does is it provides an extra layer, so you can't sell the material, or you can't sell memorabilia online or face-to-face. And it makes it a lot harder for some of those loopholes that Nazis might exploit to be utilised.
Are there enough protections for the religions like Hinduism, where the swastika is a symbol of significance?
Yeah, I would imagine that the federal government will be following the lead again of the states, and in particular Victoria, where there's been extensive community consultation about the use of the swastika in its various religious manifestations, and there are exemptions. This really only directly focuses upon the use of the swastika by white supremacists who are using it to attempt to recruit, to mobilise and to spread fear.
We talked a few weeks ago about far-right or ideological extremism, which makes up only 30% of ASIO's current terror caseload. But you were saying that these groups are actually quite clever at avoiding being listed as a terrorist organisation. It doesn't mean that these groups are inactive or that their activity is not on the rise. Is that correct?
That's correct. So these groups will employ a very violent rhetoric, and there's an implicit violence in what they're talking about. They will talk about their support for National Socialism. They'll talk about, they'll ask questions about the Holocaust. So they will run around the edges of debate, but they never come out directly and call for violence. And they're quite clever in that sense, because they know that that's the threshold at which action can be taken. But what this does is it actually prevents these groups using really violent symbology in public place. These are symbols that have a direct link to the horrors of the Holocaust, and are really not only offensive but highly intimidatory for members of our community. So it prevents them from using that in public space.
Yeah, and that's in terms of flags, armbands and T-shirts. Do we know whether this applies to tattoos?
My understanding, based on the Victorian legislation, is that it doesn't actually relate to tattoos. That would obviously require all sorts of complications around people who may already have them. So my understanding is that they've actually avoided going down that path.
Can bans have the opposite effect of what's intended and actually draw people on the fringes into movements like Nazism?
Look, that's one argument, and there's also arguments, for example, that alternative symbols will be used. So people may be familiar with the OK symbol that's used by alt-right figures. It was used by the Christchurch terrorist Brenton Tarrant, for example, in the dock when he made that symbol, and that's one argument. However, again, those actual symbols don't have the same level of power and the same level of intimidatory violence that's embedded in the swastika, in its Nazi use, in the use of the Hitler salute, for example. So we know that these actions actually prevent them from using a really powerful tool in their arsenal to spread their message about what they stand for and who they are.
Do we know why people are being drawn into these groups?
There are many deeper-seated issues, and this, in many ways, this legislation's treating a symptom of a much larger issue here. We really need a whole-of-government approach to addressing, the deepening socioeconomic inequalities in our community, in our regions in particular, our rural areas and cities and country towns, but also more broadly, looking at our education system and digital literacy, for example, social media regulation. These are all issues that are shaping the attraction of, in particular, young men, but increasingly older people as well, to extremist movements. So this is a sign of the times in many respects. This has occurred in particular over the last 5 or 10 years, but since COVID, it's really taken a bit of a fast track. So this requires a whole of government conversation about the factors that need to be addressed.
So all of the cost of living pressures and the growing economic divide could be feeding in to people's motivations to join groups like these?
Yeah, it's certainly a key factor. We know that this has played a role internationally. It played a role in the rise of far-right populism in the US, for example, but also extremist movements that really prey upon people whose their anger. These are really movements that prey upon emotion. They prey upon anger. They prey upon that sense of anxiety about the future. And really, at this point in Australia's history, it's hard to imagine a time where larger sections of the population have been feeling angry and disenfranchised and a little bit alienated as we emerge from COVID, as we face the cost of living crisis, as we face really rapidly deepening socioeconomic inequalities.